is on evolution. And a lot of times when we start evolution, people are like, oh, evolution, super controversial topic and stuff like that. It just isn't. It's not controversial at all. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the inconsistencies and misunderstandings that make it seem controversial. Okay? So the first thing that I want to talk about is something called the law of evolution. And then I want to talk about maybe some misunderstandings and things like that that come from earlier schooling. Okay, so most people, and it's getting a little better, but most people when they come into this class, they think that a hypothesis is something that you're going to test. And that once you've tested it and it turns out pretty good, that turns into a theory. And then once you've tested the theory a bunch, it turns into a law. Right? Raise your hand if you've heard that. Have you ever heard that before? That's like generally what they teach, okay? It's totally wrong. It's not a thing at all, okay? In fact, a law is something that is completely different from a theory. In fact, a theory can never, ever, ever become a law, and a law can never be a theory. In fact, they do different things. So a law is a description of events, okay? So, for instance, there's a law of gravity. The law of gravity, if I take this, says like stuff falls down. That's the law of gravity, right? Then there's many theories of gravity. There's like a theory that stuff is falling down because objects always fall towards the object with the most mass. And in our case, the core of the Earth is the thing that has the most mass, and so it falls towards the core of the Earth. Okay? That's a theory. There's another theory of gravity that says there's this field that exists in the universe that's called the Higgs field. Right? And that every object has a certain number of these particles called Higgs particles, right? And the Higgs particles interact with the Higgs field, and that's what makes things heavy. That's what gives things mass in the first place, and that's actually what influences gravity. That's a different theory of gravity, right? But when people talk about the difference between a theory and a law, they're like, gravity's a law because we know things are going to fall down. Well, yeah, of course. You're just describing what's happening. So, when you hear people say that evolution is a theory, is that like an insult? No, that's like a thing. You're explaining what's happening. But there's also a law of evolution. And the law of evolution says species change over time. Okay, can anyone refute this? No, it's irrefutable. You can look and see that species, even within a species, they can change over time. Case in point, there was no such thing as a labradoodle 20 years ago, and now everybody loves labradoodles, right? They're like the smartest, best dogs in the world, right? So species change over time. That's just something that happens. You cannot refute it. It is a description, right? That being said, there are theories of evolution. But anybody who says evolution is just a theory, you can be like, well, evolution's a law too, like if you really want to talk about it, right? But there are theories of evolution, and that's not an insult, right? To say evolution is just a theory. There's many theories of evolution, and it's okay to be a theory. Theories are explanations of why things happen. So, the theory of evolution, or theories, they say species change over time because, and then they go on to say why, right? So the very first theory, or the first theory that we're going to talk about, is Lamarck's theory. Lamarck's theory of acquired characteristics. Okay, so basically what Lamarck said was that traits that got acquired in the lifetime of an organism could be passed on to their offspring. So traits that were changed during the lifetime of an organism could be passed on to offspring. Okay? And one of the great things, perhaps the greatest thing about science, and the reason why science works, is that these theories, they have to be able to be proven false. That's like a key to a theory. So, if my theory of evolution is that species change over time because there are wizards that are doing magic and causing them to change, that's not a theory. Can you prove that there are no wizards? Prove it to me. Prove that there's no wizards.
Have you ever seen one?
Nope. Have you ever seen one?
Are there any documented cases of wizardry?
Oh, I don't know. There might be. I mean, there's definitely people who claim that magic is real, and they're based on their own experiences. If you can't disprove it, then it's not a theory, right? If it involves something else, something supernatural, then it can't happen, right? It's not a theory. So, traits that were changed during the lifetime of an organism can be passed on to the offspring. All right? Let's check it out. Let's do some terribly, horribly inhumane things. Let's take 10,000 lab rats, right? Let's cut off their right arms and then breed them together. How many of the offspring are going to be born without right arms because we cut off the right arms of their parents? 0. It's not possible. That's not a thing, right? So Lamarck's theory turns out to be largely disproven. So Lamarck had all kinds of things that he talked about. One of the things that he talked about was the giraffe. And he said, like, okay, giraffes, they got these really long necks. And the way that they got the long necks is because they worked really hard at it. Like, they would have to reach their necks up to get to the tall trees and you know, eat the leaves off the tall trees. And so over the course of a giraffe's lifetime, its neck might get like 2 inches longer. And then that's good because then the neck of the next giraffe, or the giraffe offspring, would be 2 inches longer to start with, and then they could stretch their neck out a little more, right? And you can see where we're going with this. It's not the way that things work, right? Because just stretching your neck out doesn't change your genes, right? You can see this. You've everybody seen those National Geographic pictures where like there's the tribes that put the rings around their neck to make their necks long, right? They still have to do it every generation, right? It doesn't matter if your mom had a super duper long neck. You're going to be born with a normal neck, and you got to stretch it out if you want a really long one, right? I don't know why you would, but like that's not for me to judge, okay? So if you pierce your ears 100 times, you're not going to have a kid that is born with pierced ears. That's just, it's not how it works, right? But there is a little bit of truth to this theory, okay? And it's something that's come out very recently, and that is that epigenetics. So that epigenetics will lend some truth to this theory. Okay. Now, you're still not going to be able to stretch your neck out and pass it on to your offspring, but there are some things that we've learned that can change and can affect your offspring. So for instance, we've learned that people that have a healthy lifestyle will actually produce different hormones and different proteins than people who live a unhealthy lifestyle where they are like malnourished and maybe drug users or something like that, okay? Maybe just overeating. So actually I read about it 2 or 3 days ago. There's a study just published that said that people who are obese produce less of the protein that causes them to burn fat, right? And now that's probably not a something that caused them to be obese in the first place. It's something that is caused by the fact that they are obese and therefore they have more fat and therefore it takes more muscle or more energy for them to move themselves around, right? And therefore they don't want to be burning the fat because they need that energy, right? And so their body is adapting to it. But why do they produce, what makes them produce less of that protein? Like on a molecular level, why do they produce less of the protein? Yeah. Acetylation and methylation of those genes that are making them produce that protein, okay? And what we're learning now is those acetylations and methylations, they don't all get stripped off. And so it's possible to pass this ability to produce less of a protein that allows you to burn fat, it's possible to pass that on to your offspring, right? Which then puts your offspring at a disadvantage because now they can't burn fat as well. So, something to think about, right? For a long time, if you go back and read a textbook from the 80s, they'll be like, ah, Lamarck, what an idiot, right? But now, if you read a current textbook, they're like, oh, Lamarck didn't really, hit the nail on the head here, but what he was hinting at actually does happen.
But, it's not like the same thing. It's not like he predicted, epigenetics.
No, he didn't.
He didn't know anything about epigenetics. So
I mean, but he's still sort of right. You still can acquire characteristics in your lifetime that you can pass on to your offspring. Yeah.
He's inadvertently right.
Inadvertently right, yeah. The broken clock is right twice a day, something like that. Yeah. Anyways. All right, so let's talk about Darwin then. Does anybody know what Darwin's theory is called?
Survival of the fittest?
Nope.
Natural selection.
Nope.
he asked that on purpose. I remember.
It's called Darwin's theory of descent with modification. That's what he called his theory, descent with modification. Because Darwin's theory is all about common ancestry. Okay, that's the biggest part of it. He said that organisms share common ancestry but each species is modified by the selective pressure of their environment. Okay, so selective pressure in their environment. That's where we get the survival of the fittest thing. Okay, if you are really good at living within your environment, that means you possess traits that are being selected for by your environment, and therefore you are more likely to produce offspring. Okay, and probably the most important part of Darwin's theory is that he used this term biological fitness. Okay. And biological fitness is very different than what we think about as fitness, right? We think about like, oh, you're strong, you're tall, you're fast, you can jump really high, right? Those are things that we consider fit, right? But that's not what biological fitness is. Biological fitness is the ability to survive to reproductive age and produce offspring. Now, again, I don't want to get into a political debate here or anything like that, but I wanted to bring up something to you that is perhaps a little bit alarming. Okay? If you look at these two definitions here, each species is modified based on selective pressures of their environment, and biological fitness is the ability to reproduce or to survive to reproductive age and produce offspring. Right? Right now, there is a massive negative correlation between number of offspring produced and IQ. Right? So, that means that people who have higher IQs are, for the most part, producing less children.
What?
People with lower IQs are producing significantly more children. So, Darwin, biological fitness then, says that a high IQ is actually bad. It is selected against.
So this happens for all species, not just humans?
No, just for
Wait,
humans.
is this like real?
That actually makes sense.
I am being dead serious. 100% serious.
It's like if you're in a family that has like I don't actually have 6 brothers and sisters, but if I did, then that means like my parents have like bad IQs.
No. You're using the other correlation, right? So what we're saying is overall, right, over the average of everybody, right, people who have lower IQs are producing more children than people who have higher IQs. That doesn't mean that there's not somebody who has a 175 IQ that has 8 kids. Yeah, it's just more likely. Right. And it makes sense when you think about it that we put people who are very smart into positions of power where they have a lot of responsibility and then they have no time for kids. Right? And people who don't have all that much responsibility have a lot of time to reproduce.
I thought you just meant that like lower IQ means like you're gonna have more, but I don't know.
No. So, but it's interesting to think about that. That's actually the way that our environment is. Our environment is so safe. This environment that we've created as humans is so safe that there is no pressure. Like, you're probably not going to die. Right? Like, even if you are really bad at living, like, there are laws that will try to stop you from dying. Like, hey, you got to put your kid in a car seat, or we'll pull you over and give you a ticket. So they're like, oh. And then they're like, oh, wait, I can't afford a car seat. Okay, fine, we'll give you a car seat so your kid doesn't die. Right? It's hard to die. You got to try. You got to really be going for it. All right. So yeah, there's laws against trying to die also. So like it's very difficult. All right, what's up?
This might be like a dumb question, but does smartness have to do with like your parents?
Absolutely. IQ is very much inherited. Yes. All right. Evidence for evolution. All right. So Darwin's thing.
Wait,
Yeah.
when you say evidence for evolution, do you mean evidence for the theories of evolution or evidence for the law?
Both. Okay. So comparison of extant. Those are still living. Organisms. Okay, so extant is the opposite of extinct, right? So extinct means that they're not still living, but extant means that they are still living. Okay? So perhaps the most famous example of this is Darwin's finches. And so Darwin was a naturalist, is what he called himself. And so he said that his main thing that he would look at, his main idea behind his studies, was he would go around to all these different places. He went on this voyage on the HMS Beagle, and like he went around to all these different places, one of those places being the Galapagos Islands, which was probably the best place for him to view this. But what he did was he would collect species, and he would take them and he'd actually capture them. Right, and if it was like a bird or something like that, he would taxidermy it, right? He would like stuff it and stuff, and then he would put it into like a shadow box, like a picture frame type of thing, and then he would have like a big description under it of like, this is what this bird ate, this is where this bird made its nest, this is what things tried to eat the bird, this is what the bird did when it mated, right? So he would make all these different observations, and then he would go back and he would just like pore over them, and he would say like, okay, I want to try to find correlations between this bird and why this bird looks different than this bird based on their environment and stuff like that. Okay, and what he found was very interesting. So one of the places that Darwin went was Ecuador. Right, so here's Ecuador. Yeah. Okay. And let's say on Ecuador, there's a bird, and I apologize in advance for my birds. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're just awful. Okay. So there's my bird in Ecuador, right? And this bird is plentiful food. Everything's good. You know, there's a normal amount of predators. It's been living there a long time. Everything's pretty much in equilibrium. It's been hashed out. Okay. Let's say a bird is born and it's a little bit weird, right? Maybe it's like, I don't know, fatter than normal, or it's like got a long beak or something like that. And so it's not that good at actually living in this environment where all the birds are just sort of like normal. They're like medium sized, and they have medium sized beaks, and they're pretty fast, but they're also strong. Like they're just normal, okay? And this weird bird, this bird that is a little bit of a misfit, right? He's born there and he's having trouble getting food. He's starving, right? So he's got really two options. He can either stay and die because he's going to starve to death, or he can leave and try to do something else, right? Some birds, they'll get really desperate and they'll try to like find a new thing to do in their environment. Like let's say a bird's like, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll just eat dirt. He goes and eats dirt. Does that work out for him? No, bird dies. Okay. So, yeah, it's a little sad. Evolution is very sad in general. So this bird has two choices. It can either stay and die, or it can leave and try to find food elsewhere. Okay? So let's say this bird's like, I'm going to fly out in the ocean and try to find food. So it flies up here, and there's nothing up there. It's just ocean. So this is a dead bird.
Why can't it eat? Wait.
Why can't it eat what's on the island?
Yeah, I missed that.
Because there's other birds that are there eating that stuff. So you got to remember that when things are good, when there's plentiful food and not that many predators, you just reproduce. That's all there is to life. You like eat and then you reproduce, and then you like eat some more and then you reproduce. Those are the keys. Okay?
So, like, why can't that bird eat?
Because everybody else is eating. All the other birds that are there. And this bird is a little weird. It's maybe a little fat, so he can't go as fast. Right? He's just not good at it. It's not his fault. He was just born that way. Right? So, he's leaving. He's going to go. He flies. He says, all right, forget you guys. I'm out of here. Right? And he flies and he goes over here. And this bird actually ends up on an island. Okay? So here, you've got this chunky bird. All right, how do I draw a chunky bird? He's portly.
It looks like a turkey.
Oh, that's so sad. I hate that.
All right, so he flies to this island, and there on this island there are just berries. There's like these berry plants, and there's so many berries. They're just like super easy to get, right? They're awesome. Okay, so and this island is also like there's almost no predators on there because he's the first bird there, so nothing is really big enough to eat him. Okay.
Well, why didn't he still buy
Somebody
since
made
there's
it.
no way to make it?
Well, I mean, imagine this is happening on the island or on Ecuador to like a bunch of birds. We're a bunch of like misfit birds. This is the island of misfit birds. Right. It's like Rudolph, right? All right. So on this island, then you've got all these misfit birds, and they are plentiful, and there's all this food, and everything is good, and so they reproduce with each other. And now there's a bunch of weird misfit birds there, and they reproduce so much that in fact now there's a shortage of food. Okay, I know, life is messed up. So so now you've got all these weird looking birds because all the misfits have been reproducing with each other, right? But one of them is going to be better here than all the other ones. Now, if you're in a situation where the food is readily available and there's not that much predation, who's the best?
Who gets the food fastest?
Okay, gets the food fastest. I like it.
One that eats the other bird.
Yeah, it's the meanest. The one that's like, stay away from my berry plants or I'm gonna beat you up. Right? So we're gonna make this bird mean. Right?
How did you make it?
I gave it eyebrows that are mean eyebrows. Okay? So, let's say also that for some reason, this is again the island of misfit birds, that it happens to be the meanest birds also have this linked gene, right? That also gives them this weird mohawk. So he's a fat, mean Mohawk bird. All right? Now, you guys can agree with me that it's difficult for a female to assess who is mean just by looking at them, right? I mean, like, in my picture, they've got the mean eyebrows, but like they probably don't have the mean eyebrows, right? But if it turns out that the gene for aggression is also linked to a Mohawk, then selecting for a Mohawk would obviously get you the meanest mate, right? And the meanest mate is the most biologically fit here because they're going to be able to chase away the other birds and prevent them from eating the berries, right? So if a bird then starts to select for the Mohawk, you might be like, why would a bird select for Mohawks? That's stupid. That obviously doesn't help them at all, but it's linked to something else that does help them, right? So for instance, right, broad shoulders, chiseled chin, jawbone, right? These are things that females select for. If they do. Why?
It's just a biological fit.
But why?
Because they're stronger to fight off the other males.
Why? Why does broad shoulders and a... Yeah, there you go. These are traits that develop because of testosterone, because of high levels of testosterone. Okay? High levels of testosterone are related to aggression, are related to strength. Strength and aggression are good things to select for because they keep your kids safe.
And so is evolution sort of slowing down with humans if like it's harder?
Well, we figured out it's kind of going in reverse, right? Well, okay. So that's a really good point. That was a terrible thing for me to say. I should. It's important to understand that evolution has no purpose. There's no goal in mind, right? So evolution is not trying to make us awesome humans, right? It's not trying to make us stronger and faster and bigger and smarter. That's not what evolution is doing. Evolution is trying to make more of us. It's working really well. There's like 7.2 billion people on Earth. It's doing a great job, right? It's finding the people that will reproduce the most and allowing them to reproduce a lot and keeping them alive. It's working. It's not making us stronger or faster or more healthy or smarter or anything like that. It's just like it's making more of us. That's its job. Okay? So evolution wasn't trying to make a fat, mean Mohawk bird here. It just happened to do that because those are the selective pressures that were on its environment or in its environment. Okay? Now we got a bunch of fat, mean Mohawk birds here. And if it's anything like my experience in high school, Mohawk people, they were mean, right? And I was more of like a skinny person. There's high school Mr. Tate and current Mr. Tate. I know. All right. So this bird, I'm not drawing the beak yet on purpose. Okay. This bird moves to this island over here, and this island over here has berry plants as well. So here's some berries, but with one little change. berry plants have thorns. Okay? So let's say fat, mean Mohawk bird comes over and tries to live on this island. Right? What happens to him? He pokes his eyes out when he's trying to get berries. And then he can't live because he can't see. Right? You can't be mean if you can't see. I guess you could, but it wouldn't work very well. That means that skinny bird might be able to like poke his little head in between the thorns. Hey, we have a purpose, right? It's good. Whatever is good for this environment. Okay, let's say it's also really good to have a longer beak. So he's got a slightly longer beak. Okay, but let's say it's good to have a really long beak. Okay, so this bird here has like a 3/4 inch bird or 3/4 of an inch beak, right? And let's say his mate also has a 3/4 inch beak, and they're slightly longer than normal. Let's say the normal beak is like a 1/2 inch. Okay, what could their offspring have?
3/4 inch beak.
Could have 3/4 inch. Could have 1/2 inch.
Oh, if they get both of the 3/4 genes.
If they get both of the big genes, then they could have an inch-long beak. Is that better? Yes. Right? We've talked about this, I think, before. We talked about Yao Ming in here before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Yao Ming, giant, human, is the result of giant human mom, giant human dad, making an even more giant human offspring. Okay? So, semi-long beak plus semi-long beak sometimes makes shorter beak. That offspring pokes his eyes out and dies, right? Sometimes makes also semi-long beak. That offspring probably lives. But sometimes makes super long beak. And that offspring gets a ton of food. Ton of food means that it can survive and then pass on its genes to the next generation. It's going to pass on the long beak genes to the next generation, right? So if we take this and we call this the original species here, what we see is that this original species moves outward, right? And that process is called adaptive radiation. Okay, adaptive radiation doesn't have anything to do with like gamma rays or anything like that, like not nuclear or anything. But it means that they're radiating outward. They're starting at the center and moving outwards. Okay? So if we say that this is the original species, they radiate outwards, and as they radiate outwards and they encounter new environments, they adapt to those new environments. Okay? And so we still might see some traits that were present on this island, right? But they have to now have adapted also to this island, right? Makes sense? So the further that you get out, the less similar they are to the original species. Yeah?
How long does it take before like the trait becomes obvious, like the Mohawk one?
You can't really answer that question. It depends on how big the selective pressure is. If it's like a mortality rate of, let's say, 5%, like 5% of the organisms that don't have that trait die, then it's going to be very slow. But if it's a mortality rate of like 95%, 95% of the organisms that don't have that trait die, then it'll be very quick. Right? So depending on the trait, it can change. Okay? Questions on this? All right, let's talk about the other stuff. Let's talk about comparing extinct species. In the fossil record. Extinct, not extincts. Extinct species. Okay? So there's a problem here, and that is when you're looking at fossil records, you don't really know a whole lot about the lifestyle of the organism or where it lived or what it did or anything like that. A lot of that is just like contrived by looking at the bone structure, where the bones might have attached to ligaments and tendons and stuff like that to see what kind of movement they would have had. So a lot of it is just extrapolation on things that we do know about current species. Okay? So there's a big problem with what's called homology versus analogy. Okay. So homology versus analogy, there are these things called homologous structures. Homologous structures are structures that are from a common ancestor that now perform different functions. Structures from a common ancestor that are modified to perform different functions. Okay, so for instance, if you look at like your hands have a very specific amount of bones in them and a very specific structure. Our hands are for one purpose, and that is for grasping things. We're very good at grasping. We can climb and pick food and plant food and stuff like that. Okay, but if you look at like a bat, okay, a bat has hands as well, meaning they have like the same bones, but the bones are weird. They're skinny and they're long, right? And their bones that would normally make up the hand are actually in their wing, right? So a bat uses its hands to fly. The exact same bones, right? The same number of bones, the same shape of bones, but they're just modified a little bit to be skinnier and longer, right? But overall, they're in the same orientation and stuff like that. Two different functions, right? Whales, same thing. They've got hands, but their hands are flippers. Right, so all their bones are a little bit stubbier, right, and they've got more structure to them, so that that allows them to push the water, and they can't see, a whale can't like hold on to a Coke or anything like that, right? They can't grasp. They're swimming with it, so they're different, but they're from common ancestry because we know that at some point there was a common ancestor that had a hand-like structure, that then got modified into all those different things. Okay. So there's another type of homologous structure that's even more interesting called a vestigial structure. And vestigial structures are homologous structures that don't have a function anymore.
Is this like our tailbone?
Yep. So we've got vertebrae that extend back beyond our pelvis, right? And they don't really serve any purpose because we don't have tails. But if we did have tails, they would be tail vertebrae. We call them tail bones, right? And those are vestigial. There's even more sort of wild examples of this. In fact, perhaps the most wild example is that some whales have femurs, right? So if you think about like where your femur is. This is your femur here, right? It's in your leg. Do whales have legs? No. Okay. And the weird thing is, if we look where the femur is in the whale, it's just like tucked up in their body. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any muscles really attached to it that are doing anything. It's just there because it used to be there, and it's still there because the genes are still there, right? It serves no purpose at all. Now, is it bad for a whale to produce a femur if it's not going to use it?
Yes.
Yeah, it takes energy, right, to do that. Now, is it bad enough that it would cause them to die? No. So, what Raylan was saying, if the mortality rate of having a femur is 0.00001% because you have a femur, is that enough to really remove it from the population? No. Are there whales that don't have femurs? Yes. Are they at a significant advantage over a whale that does have a femur? Not really. So it's going to take a while. Unless there turns out to be some new mutation or something like that where the femur gets sharp and like starts poking their internal organs, then we're going to start to see a higher mortality rate for having a femur, and therefore the femur will then be selected against, and we'll see less whales with femurs. Right? All right. Last thing. Let's talk about analogous structures. Analogous structures are structures that look the same and perform the same function, but are not from common ancestry. evolved on their own, not from common ancestry. Okay, so a really good example of this, perhaps the best example of it, is the thorn. Okay, so lots of things have thorns. Roses have thorns, cacti have thorns, right? But the thorns of a rose are not related to the thorns of a cactus. Okay, they were not from common ancestry. Even though they're both pointy, sharp things that stop you from picking up the plant and trying to eat it, right? They didn't come from the same thing. It just turns out that it's really good if you're a plant to not get eaten. And a really good way to not get eaten is to have pointy things, right? And those pointy things are not that tough to actually evolve. If you think about these plants that are already growing little stems and stuff, little offshoots of them, it's not that hard to grow a very small offshoot that gets harder than all the other ones, right? So there's something that evolved many times. Flight is another one. Birds fly, bats fly, flies fly, right? But the wings of a bird and a bat and a fly are not related to one another. They're something that evolved separately. Analogous. Which again, if you're looking at a fossil record, it's kind of hard to see that. You can say like, oh, this organism has a structure that allows them to fly. So does this one. Does that mean that they're related to one another? Not necessarily. You have to actually compare those structures and say, is this structure similar enough to this one that warrants us, or that would warrant us thinking that they are related species? Questions on that?